They said Gordon Fisk had thrown away the only real money he'd ever saved on a condemned feed store that smelled like mildew and mouse nests and had been slowly losing its argument with gravity for 30 years. And for 12 years his widow believed them. Naomi Fisk was 56 years old on the morning she finally drove herself down Sycamore Flat Road to see it for the first time. She had $83 in her checking account, the last of what had survived 12 years of widowhood, 2 part-time jobs, and 1 laundromat that had locked its doors the previous Thursday with a handwritten note taped to the glass. She had a 2007 Civic with a passenger side that worked and a driver's side that didn't, a paper bag with 4 days' worth of groceries, and a folded note she had carried in the front pocket of her purse since the night before Gordon's surgery, written in his slow left-handed print. "Do not sell the Perley place. I know you don't understand it. I'll explain when I'm back. Promise me." He was never back. For 12 years, Naomi had kept that promise, the way you keep a light burning in a window for someone who is never going to use it. Not because it makes sense, but because turning it off would mean something you're not ready to mean. She had paid the property taxes on the Perley feed store each year from money she did not have. $40 in the good years, $60 in the years the county raised the rate, small enough that Gordon's brother Vincent had called it a rounding error, large enough that Naomi had eaten rice for a week more times than she would ever admit to anyone. She had never driven out to see it. She had not been ready to understand it, and so she had not looked. But a woman with $83 and no job, and a landlord who had already been patient twice, cannot afford to keep not looking at things. Before we go any further, I want to tell you where this story goes. Not because I want to spoil it, because what Naomi found inside that old building is the kind of thing that changes what the beginning of the story means. And if you've ever held on to something you couldn't explain, a promise, a piece of property, a dead person's quiet insistence, then stay with me all the way to the end. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And now let me take you back to that October Tuesday, when Naomi Fisk drove out to see the thing everyone had told her was worthless. She had met Gordon at a church social in 1989, when she was 23 and he was 26. And she had thought he was too quiet to be interesting, and then found out he was the most interesting person in the room. He was a furniture repairman with careful hands and a habit of noticing things other people walked past. He could look at a broken chair and tell you not just what was wrong with it, but what the person who broke it had been doing when it gave way. He had that quality, the quality of a man who paid attention to the thing itself rather than his own opinion of the thing. They married in 1991. They had no children, and after the first few years of grief about that, they had made a life that was full without them. Gordon worked out of a small shop behind the house. Naomi managed the front office at a dental practice for 20 years. They were not rich, they were not going to be. But they were steady, and steady, Naomi had always believed, was worth more than it got credit for. Gordon died in the spring of 2013, 12 years ago now, on a Tuesday, during a surgery that had been described to them as routine. He was 50 years old. Naomi had been sitting in a waiting room that smelled of bad coffee and industrial carpet when the surgeon came in and used the careful, measured language that surgeons use. When the careful, measured language is all they have left to offer. She had held a magazine she had not read a single word of for 4 hours. After Gordon, the house went. She could not carry it alone, not on a receptionist's salary with the practice downsizing. And after the house came the series of smaller and smaller arrangements that had brought her, finally, to a one-bedroom apartment above a print shop in the town of Cutter's Creek, where she had worked first at the hardware store and then at a laundromat 3 days a week, and where she had tried, without much success, to stop measuring her life against what it had been. What she had never done, through all of it, was touch the Perley place. Gordon's brother Vincent had called it foolishness from the beginning. Vincent was the kind of man who measured foolishness precisely. Gordon had paid $420 at a county tax auction for a condemned commercial property on a dead-end road. And what exactly did a furniture repair man think he was going to do with an old feed store? The building had been empty since 1987, when old Amos Perley's grandson had finally locked it up and walked away. The county had condemned it in 1994. The roof had been patched with tarps. The front window had been plywood for as long as anyone could remember. You could not have given that building away. Naomi had agreed with Vincent, which was the thing she had to sit with now. Sycamore Flat Road turned from asphalt to gravel to something that was mostly the memory of gravel. And then the Perley feed store came into view at the end of a long flat stretch, and Naomi stopped the car. It was bigger than she'd expected. Not large, 2 stories at the front, 1 at the back, with a wide covered porch that had buckled in the middle, so it curved upward at both ends like a sorry grin. The clapboard siding had gone the color of old pewter. The plywood on the front window had cracked along the grain, and the cracks had gone dark with weather. A condemnation notice, bleached almost colorless, hung from a nail by the door. Over the roofline, a single sweet gum tree had sent a branch through the eave on the left side and grown there, calm and established, the way trees will when no one stops them. Naomi got out of the car. The October air was sharp and smelled of cold ground and fallen leaves, and something underneath that she recognized without naming, the smell of a rural place that has been waiting a long time without complaint. She had expected to feel whatever the opposite of hope is. She had expected the plain disappointment of a thing confirmed. Instead, she felt something stranger, which was the feeling of a door she had not known, was closed, beginning very slowly to open. The padlock on the front door had rusted through in one corner. She found a length of iron pipe on the porch and worked it free, and the door swung inward, on hinges that groaned and then gave, and the smell that came out was nothing like the outside air. Sawdust, linseed oil, shellac gone dry and faintly sweet. The compressed particular silence of a room that has not been disturbed in a very long time. Naomi stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. It was a workshop. She had expected rot, ruin, a dirt floor, the wreckage of something past saving. What she stepped into instead was a craftsman's space, still and suspended, the way a room looks when the person who kept it last walked out, still meaning to come back. A long workbench ran the length of the far wall, lit by pale daylight through the cracked boards of the plywood window. Above it, tools hung on a pegboard with their outlines traced in pencil, chisels and gouges and rasps, and a set of bent knives. Naomi did not know the names of their handles, dark with decades of use, their edges spotted faintly with rust but their order undisturbed, exact. And on the shelves, on every shelf, on the bench, on the floor in careful rows were toys. Wooden toys. Horses mostly, but also dogs and rabbits, and birds with jointed wings, and small human figures with articulated arms, and what appeared to be a miniature barn with a sliding door that still moved when she touched it. They were in every stage of completion. Some rough-shaped from the block the form barely suggested, some fully carved and painted in colors that had faded to something softer than they had originally been, but no less beautiful for that. Each one had been finished with a care that went past what working toys required. You could see it in the way the grain had been followed, in the way each animal's posture carried something specific. Not the generic stance of a manufactured thing, but the individual attitude of something that had been observed. Naomi picked up a horse. It was small, the length of her hand, carved from a single piece of pale wood, with a flowing mane and a neck arched in the particular way. A real horse arches it when something has caught its attention. The paint had cracked along the shoulder, but the detail beneath was extraordinary. Each muscle suggested rather than stated. The eye a small chip of amber glass that caught the gray light and held it. She set it down and picked up another and another. She did not yet understand what she was looking at. She only knew that whoever had made these could not stop himself from making them honest. Naomi spent the first 2 days doing what she knew how to do, which was to clean a space until she could see it clearly. She brought a broom and a bucket and rags from the car, and she moved through the workshop the way she had moved through every difficult room in her adult life, methodically, one corner at a time, letting the work settle her thoughts into something manageable. On the 3rd day, she found the wall. She had been working along the back of the store, cataloging the toys on the lowest shelves, when her rag caught on something. She crouched and looked. The boards along the inner wall ran floor to ceiling like the rest of the shop, vertical tongue and groove painted over in the same dull cream. But here, behind the last shelf, there was a seam that did not align with the others. A section roughly 3 feet wide, where the boards met at a slightly different angle, close enough that you would never see it, if you were not crouching at floor level, with your hand flat against the paint. She pressed. The wall gave the smallest amount, a breath of flex, where solid wall should have had none. Naomi sat back on her heels in the dusty light and felt something she had learned, over 12 years, to be very careful with. Not hope, something earlier than hope. The feeling of a question that has been sitting in the dark for a very long time, beginning to sense that an answer is close. She found a thin pry bar in the tool rack above the bench, and then she stopped herself and breathed. Because 12 years is long enough to know that some moments deserve to be entered slowly. Then she worked the bar into the seam at the top, and the old adhesive gave way in a slow, reluctant crack, and the panel came away in her hands. Lighter than it looked, a door, hinged so flush with the wall that the hinges had been entirely invisible. Behind it, shelves, narrow and deep, built into the cavity of the wall, with the same patient care as everything else in the shop. The wood was darker here, untouched by light for what might have been decades, and the air that breathed out of it was dry and still and carried a faint sweetness she couldn't place. There were 4 shelves, and on each shelf, wrapped carefully in old flannel and then again in muslin, were toys unlike the ones on the open shelves. She unwrapped the first one with cold fingers, a horse, but not like the horses outside. This one was the length of her forearm, carved from a single block of figured wood that moved in the light with a depth she had not seen before. The grain following the curve of the haunches, as though the wood itself had wanted to become this shape. The mane had been carved in individual strands, each one slightly different. The eye was amber glass with something behind it she could have fallen into. On the bottom of the base, burned cleanly into the wood, 2 initials inside the outline of a tree, AP. She unwrapped them one by one, and the count rose, and her wonder rose with it. A pair of rabbits, mid-leap, their ears laid back. A bird with each feather individually suggested, its head cocked at an angle that was somehow entirely specific, as though the maker had watched one particular bird for a long time before he touched the wood. A set of human figures, a woman, a man, 3 children, carved with an intimacy that was not sentimental but true. 47 pieces in all, each one wrapped with the deliberate care of something that was meant to be found by the right person at the right time. And at the back of the lowest shelf, wrapped in flannel and then in oilcloth tied with a leather thong, was a book. Naomi untied the thong with fingers that had gone cold all the way through. It was a composition notebook, the old kind with a marbled cover, but the spine had been rebound in leather by careful hands. She opened it to the first page, and in ink that had gone from black to brown but remained perfectly legible, in a careful, self-taught hand that had clearly written a great deal to teach itself, to write this well, someone had written. Amos James Perley, his account, begun in the year 1923. And below it, one line underlined twice. A toy doesn't teach a child to play. It teaches a child that the world still has room for them. Naomi read it 3 times in the failing afternoon light. Then she turned the page and began to read the life of a man who had been dead since 1961. Amos Perley had been born in Harlan County in 1892, the son of a coal man and the grandson of a man who had been enslaved. He had learned to work wood from his father's father in a shed behind the house, learning the names of tools before he had reliable shoes, learning the grain of different woods the way other children learned the faces of neighbors, by touch and long attention. He had come to Haddock's Mill in 1918 and had opened the feed store not as a toy maker but as a working merchant, because a black man in rural Tennessee in 1918 who wanted to own a business had to own something people needed. He sold seed and feed and hardware, and he made his toys in the back of the store in the hours before dawn, before the first customers came. The notebook taught Naomi the rest, page by careful page. He had started giving the toys away around 1920, not selling, giving. There had been a girl in town, 7 years old, whose mother had died the previous winter, whose father was managing a grief that had turned into a bottle, and who had come into the store one December morning to buy cornmeal on credit, and had stood at the counter and stared at a carved rabbit. Amos had left sitting there and could not look away from it. He had wrapped it for her in newspaper and told her it was a Christmas gift from the store. He had never done such a thing before. He would spend the next 40 years doing it. The notebook was his record. Every child received a line, name, year, what he had given them. And always, one thing he had noticed about them, not a judgment, an observation. The girl who could name every bird at the feeder by its song. The boy who apologized to things he bumped into, furniture and door frames and the farm animals. The child who read every label in the store, top to bottom, moving his lips, teaching himself silently, while his parents talked to Amos about spring planting. He kept count of the toys he sold in the cities. Nashville, Cincinnati, as far north as Chicago, shipped through contacts he had built carefully over years, and he kept a second account of where that money went. It went to a one-room schoolhouse he built on land he owned 3 miles outside of town, where, from 1931 to 1956, children who had no school to attend, black children, denied by law, and the white children of families too poor and too far out to reach the county schools, were taught to read, to write, to calculate, by a rotating set of teachers Amos recruited and housed and paid from toy money. He never told anyone in town. The notebook was plain about why. The year was 1931, and some forms of good work could only survive if they were invisible. Naomi read until the light was entirely gone, and then she read by the flashlight on her phone, sitting on the floor of the workshop with the composition notebook open on her knees, and when she turned the last page, she sat for a long time in the dark. She thought about Gordon, about why a furniture repairman from Cutter's Creek had paid $420 for this building, had made her promised to keep it, had left her a note the night before a surgery he might have suspected he would not wake up from. She turned to the inside back cover of the notebook, and there, in pencil, faint but perfectly legible, was a list of names. Later hands, she would come to understand. The people who had known about the book, who had kept the building for exactly this reason. And near the bottom, in the careful left-handed print she would have known anywhere, she found his name. Gordon Allen Fisk. His grandfather taught himself to read in Amos Perley's schoolhouse. I hold this in his name. He had known. He had driven out to this store one day before she ever knew it existed. And he had read this same notebook, and he had bought the building for the same reason a man does a thing he cannot explain. Because a debt of that size does not get paid back. It only gets paid forward. He had not been able to find the words, in the years they had together, to bring her into it. He had simply run out of time, the way good men do. And in his place, 12 years late and down to her last $83, his widow sat on the floor of a closed feed store in the October dark, and finally understood what she had been keeping. The next morning Naomi drove to a shop on the main street of Haddock's Mill. She had passed 100 times without going in. A serious, cluttered place called Sycamore Antiques and Americana, run by a man named Calvin Price who had white hair and the attentive quality of someone who had learned that patience was the whole of the job. She put 2 of the hidden pieces on his counter without a word. Calvin Price looked at them for a long time without touching them. Then he turned the horse over and found the AP brand burned into its base and sat down very slowly on a stool, as if his legs had reached a decision without consulting him. Where, he said carefully, did you get these? Naomi told him. Calvin Price took off his glasses, which is what people do. She would learn, when something requires them to reorganize the last several decades of what they believed was true. He told her what she had. Amos Perley's name was not unknown in the world of American folk art, but his surviving work was almost entirely confined to a handful of working pieces in private collections, and one small carved horse at the Tennessee State Museum. It had been understood among the people who cared about such things that Perley's finest work, the gallery-quality decorative pieces he was reported to have made late in life, had been lost when the feed store was abandoned. Some had concluded they probably never existed at all. The story had been filed away alongside other quiet tragedies of the form. The genius with no records, the work that did not survive the century. What was sitting on Calvin Price's counter was a Perley horse in original untouched condition. He told her she needed an appraiser who handled American folk art at the highest level. He told her not to open her door to anyone who came knocking uninvited, and then he asked, very quietly, if he might see the notebook. When she put it in his hands and he read the first page, and then the line below it, a toy doesn't teach a child to play. It teaches a child that the world still has room for them. Calvin Price had to set the notebook down and look out the window at the empty street for a while before he could speak. If this story is finding you at a moment when the world doesn't feel like it has room for you, stay right here with us. Subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Because what comes next is the part that changes what the beginning of this story means. The appraiser came down from Nashville 6 days later. Her name was Dr. Sandra Hewitt, and she spent 2 full days in the workshop, photographing every piece, examining the paint surfaces through a loop for any sign of restoration, cross-referencing the AP brand against the catalog raisonné a folk art scholar had assembled on Perley 3 decades earlier. She read the notebook twice. The second time, she did not speak for an hour. When she finally sat down with Naomi at the old workbench, she said she wanted to be exact, because precision was the only respect she could offer something like this. The 47 pieces in the hidden cache were, taken together, the most significant single discovery of American vernacular folk art to surface in 22 years. The decorative works, the horses, the birds, the human figures, were masterworks. In their current condition untouched, original surface, sealed dry in a wall cabinet, for 4 decades they were extraordinary. She turned her notebook toward Naomi and let her read the number she had written. The working range was $280,000 on the low end, $460,000 on the high. The notebook, she added quietly, was not something that would go to a private collector, that belonged in a museum. The Fisk Jubilee Collection at Vanderbilt had been building an archive of African-American material culture and craft history for 20 years. She would help Naomi see it placed correctly, if Naomi would allow her. Naomi drove back to the store that evening and sat on the front porch in the cold dark with the October stars moving over the flat Tennessee sky, and let the size of it become real at the pace it needed to. She did not cry. She had done her crying a long time ago, in a waiting room that smelled of bad coffee and industrial carpet. 11 days later, the trouble started. His name was Breck Talmadge, and he arrived in a dark green Land Rover that did not belong to Haddock's Mill, wearing the relaxed, expensive clothing of a man for whom being relaxed is a form of pressure. He was a private dealer, he explained, in American folk art and sporting collectibles, working with a client who had a strong interest in regional vernacular work. He had heard the most fascinating rumor. He simply had to come and see. He was charming. He admired the building. He stepped inside and looked at the open shelves of working toys with an expression of warm, mild interest, and he did not glance at the false panel in the back wall, which told Naomi, who had spent enough years reading the faces of people who entered rooms. They already knew the layout of exactly how much he already knew, and from whom he had learned it. He came to the point gently, the way such men do. The toys were charming, he said, very regional. A thin market, unfortunately, and condition issues with stored wooden pieces were always a challenge for auction. He would hate to see her get her hopes up with an appraiser who didn't truly understand the market. He liked her situation. He liked her. He was prepared to make an offer right now. This week, cash. No waiting on auctions that might take 18 months. The full lot, the toys and whatever documentation there was. $55,000. For 47 masterworks, and the notebook that a university museum would build an archive around. He said it warmly, the way you say a thing to a person you have already finished underestimating. Naomi thought about Amos Perley carving in the dark hours before dawn, giving toys to children the county had decided didn't count, keeping records no one would see, funding a schoolhouse he never put his name on. She thought about the line, on the first page of the notebook, and what it meant to have spent a lifetime making something true, when the whole world was telling you to stop. She said no thank you, politely. Her mother had taught her that. He raised the number. She said no again. He raised it a third time, and when she held still, the warmth went out of his face the way heat goes out of a room when a door opens on a cold night. And the last thing he said before he got back in the Land Rover was not quite a threat, but it sat in the air the way one does. He said he hoped the question of title and provenance wouldn't get complicated for her. It got complicated 9 days later. Gordon's brother Vincent had not thought about the Perley place in 12 years. He had called it foolishness in 2013, and he had not revisited the subject, because the subject had nothing to revisit. But $400,000 changes the geometry of a family's memory, and what Vincent filed was a claim that the property had been purchased during the marriage with marital funds, that Naomi's title was accordingly not sole, and that the contents, having been part of the property, belonged to the estate of Gordon Fisk, which meant to his heirs, which meant to Gordon's brother and 2 sisters, who had not paid a single dollar of taxes on the place in 12 years, and had not once driven the road to see it. It was constructed. Naomi understood that the moment she read it, but a constructed claim filed with the court still requires an answer. still costs money and sleep, and the particular grinding exhaustion of being told that something you earned is not yours. She found a lawyer in the county seat. Her name was Audra Keene, and she was steady and unhurried in the way of a person who already knows the shape of the morning, before she walks into the courtroom. Audra read the claim and the will and the deed, and then she read the notebook, carefully, from first page to last. And then she found the thing Vincent had not counted on, because Vincent, like most people who underestimate someone, had never once truly looked at Gordon Fisk. Gordon had not been a man who spoke easily, but he had been a man who prepared. Filed with the will 7 years before his death was a statement he had asked his lawyer to draft, sign, and witness without telling Naomi. In it, Gordon stated in his slow, plain language that the Perley property at Sycamore Flat Road, all structures, all land, all contents known and undiscovered, belonged to his wife Naomi Fisk entirely and alone. That this was his deliberate and considered wish. That he made it with full knowledge that the property might prove to hold value he could not yet measure, and that no member of his family had contributed to its purchase, its upkeep, or its preservation, and none had the standing to claim any part of it. Known and undiscovered, he had written those words on purpose. He had foreseen exactly this. He had built the protection before it was needed, the way a careful man builds the foundation before he builds the walls. He had reached across 7 years, and then 12 more, to explain himself at last. The hearing was on a cold December morning in the county courthouse. Vincent and his sisters arrived with an attorney from Nashville. Naomi arrived with Audra Keene, who carried one folder and the unhurried calm of someone who already knows how the morning ends. Audra Keene stood and read the operative section of Gordon's statement aloud. She noted that it had been signed, witnessed, and filed 7 years before any cache of toys was discovered, which made it impossible to characterize as anything other than the testator's deliberate, forward-looking intention. She noted that Vincent and his sisters had received and accepted their own bequests from Gordon's estate 12 years ago, and had raised no question of fairness then, when the Perley place was a condemned building on a dead road that nobody wanted. She noted without editorializing that not one of them had contributed $1 to the property taxes across those 12 years, or driven the road once, or asked about the building at all, until the week after a private dealer's Land Rover was seen parked outside it. Then she sat down, because there was nothing else that needed saying. The judge was a plain-spoken woman who had grown up 2 counties over, and who knew exactly what a condemned feed store on a dead-end road was worth to a family in lean years, and what it became worth to a family the moment someone else decided it mattered. She read Gordon's statement twice. She looked at Vincent over her glasses with an expression that said several things without requiring words. Then she found the words anyway. She said the will was unambiguous. She said the testator's intent had been expressed with unusual foresight and clarity. She said that a thing not known to exist cannot be characterized as an undisclosed asset, and that the testator had plainly contemplated exactly that circumstance and provided for it with care. She dismissed the claim in its entirety. And then she added one thing more, looking not at the lawyers but at Vincent and his sisters directly, that the court had seen many families over many years, and that the thing which revealed a person most reliably was not hardship but money, and that they might wish to sit privately with what their own conduct over the past 3 months had revealed about them. Then she moved to the next matter on her docket, and it was over. In the marble hallway outside, one of Gordon's sisters opened her mouth as if to say something. Sorry, perhaps, or some version of a defense, and then found she had nothing to put in the air that would survive the light of that morning, and closed it again and walked away. Naomi did not call after her. The shanty was hers, completely and officially and finally, the way it had been hers all along. The 47 pieces sold over the following 8 months, handled by Dr. Sandra Hewitt, through the careful channels such things deserve. The decorative horses went to a collector in Vermont who had been looking for a Perley for 15 years and could not speak when he held one. The birds went to a folk art museum in Memphis building a collection of Black Southern craft tradition. The human figures, the carved family, rendered with such specific tenderness, went to the Smithsonian, which is where the specifically tender things belong. The great horse, the finest of them all, sold at auction in the spring for a sum that made the room go quiet to hear. When it was over, After the commissions and the taxes she paid to the dollar, because Amos Perley's notebook had taught her that an honest account is its own form of dignity, Naomi had $391,000. The notebook she did not sell. She gave it to the Fisk Jubilee Collection at Vanderbilt on one condition, that it be displayed under Amos Perley's name, with the full story told, the toys and the children and the schoolhouse, all of it, and that the line from the first page be engraved into the wall, above the display case where every visitor would see it. A toy doesn't teach a child to play. It teaches a child that the world still has room for them. The university agreed without hesitation, and they asked, when they had understood the whole of it, whether the display might also include the story of the furniture repairman from Cutter's Creek, who had paid $420 to keep the secret safe, and left the documentation his wife would need to defend it. Naomi said yes, and that was how Gordon Allen Fisk, who had never been able to find the words in life, came to have his name on a university wall beside the man he had spent his quiet life honoring. The first thing Naomi spent money on was the building itself. She had the condemnation reviewed and lifted. She hired local for everything she could, a carpenter named Darnell Morse, whose grandfather's name was in the notebook, one line, 1941, a boy who had been given a carved dog and who had grown up to be a man who talked about that dog until the day he died. Darnell did not charge her for the labor. He only told her to tell the story right when people came, which she promised she would do. She had the porch leveled and the plywood replaced with real glass. She had the roof made sound and the siding painted the soft gray-green it might once have been. The workbench she did not refinish, because the worn places in it were the record of every pair of hands that had ever worked there, and she was not going to sand that history away. The tools she sharpened and rehung above the bench. Each one returned to its outline. The grindstone turned again. The toy shelves she left exactly as she had found them. And in the spring, 14 months after the morning, she had driven down Sycamore Flat Road with $83. And a promise she didn't understand. Naomi Fisk opened the doors of the Perley workshop to the children of the county and began teaching them to carve. She was not a carver herself, not yet, but she had Calvin Price, who came on Wednesdays and showed the children how to read the grain of a block before the knife ever touched it, to feel for the run of it with a thumb so that the blade went with the wood rather than against it. And she had the notebook memorized, and the notebook was better than any instruction manual, because Amos Perley had written down not just how but why the work mattered, why a child's hands on a piece of wood was not a small thing, why the finished object was almost beside the point compared to the hours spent in the making of it. The children she taught were the ones the county had a way of overlooking. Kids from the farms out past the flat road. Kids whose parents were stretched past stretching. Kids who came in hungry and whom Naomi fed first alls. Because Amos Perley had written plainly on page 14 that you cannot teach a hungry child and it is dishonest to try. She kept her own account in a new composition notebook she bought at the dollar store in the same format Amos had used. Name, year, what they made, and one thing she noticed. Not charity. Wages paid in advance against work that would never be asked for. There was a boy in the first winter she would remember as long as she lived. His name was Marcus, 10 years old, who sat at the end of the bench with his jaw set and his eyes down, holding a block of soft pine like it had already beaten him. He did not believe he would be any good at this, because he had been told, in many ways and many rooms, that he was not good at things. Naomi sat beside him. She put her hands over his and guided the knife through the first long pull of the stroke, slow, the two of them moving together, and the wood curled away and a curve appeared that had not been there before. The beginning of a shoulder, the beginning of a neck, the beginning of a horse that was still entirely inside the block but was already unmistakably on its way out. Marcus looked at it. Then he looked at his own hands with an expression she had seen once before. In her own face, in a mirror in the Perley workshop, the morning after she had read the notebook by flashlight and sat in the dark and finally understood. The expression of someone who has just been introduced to a version of themselves they did not know existed. Naomi had to stand up and busy herself at the back of the room, so the boy would not see that a grown woman was crying over a half-carved horse. She understood, standing there in the cold cedar-scented air of the old Perley workshop, that the toys had never been the point. They had never been the point for Amos Perley either. They had been the reason. The reason to open the doors before dawn, the reason to keep records no one would see, the reason to pay the taxes on a building that looked worthless from the outside, the excuse to sit beside a frightened child and put your hands over their hands and show them that they could make something true. Gordon had not left her a condemned feed store. He had left her a place at the end of a long line of people who had looked at the ones the world was throwing away and decided, quietly, without recognition, without stopping, to set something warm out for them to come home to. The men who had measured Gordon Fisk and found him foolish had made the oldest and most expensive mistake there is, which is to believe that the price of a thing and the worth of a thing are the same. They had looked at a sagging building on a dead-end road and seen nothing, because nothing was all they had been trained to look for. They had never understood that the most valuable things a person can leave behind are almost never the things that show. They are sealed behind false panels. They are written in self-taught hands in composition notebooks no one thinks to open. They are the promise you keep without knowing why, through every year of not knowing, until the morning you finally drive to the end of the road and find out what you've been holding all along. A toy doesn't teach a child to play. It teaches a child that the world still has room for them. Naomi Fisk knew by that first winter in the workshop that it always had, and she was going to spend the rest of her life making sure every child who walked through that door knew it too. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. That means more than you know. Leave us a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from tonight, and tell us the name of someone who saw your worth when no one else was looking. We read every single one. There are 2 more stories waiting for you on your screen, and if this one found its way to something in you tonight, those will too. Just tap to keep watching, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell so the next quiet story finds its way to you.